Well, it certainly is great to be here. I realise that most of you will not understand a word that I say because English is my second language after New Zealand. But it's great to be here in Iowa, and especially good to have this opportunity to reflect with you. Thank you, Kevin, for your words. It was well into last century that we met, as you said, at the Christian Spirituality Program. And thank you, Todd, for your words. Of course, the feeling is totally mutual, you and Lisa and so many other people that I've met through you. And in January, I remember a dinner that I had in Iowa last year, and there were 8 people or so at the dinner, and we were talking about New Zealand. People were saying, what is it like in New Zealand? And I was trying to explain, and they said, oh, we must come to New Zealand. And I said, as I always do, what a great idea, come to New Zealand, knowing that they wouldn't. And a few weeks later, they emailed me and said, we're coming. There's 6 of us, 7 of us are on our way. And so we had this wonderful visit in New Zealand. They may tell you that it's well worth the 14-hour plane ride from the east coast of the west coast of the United States. So if you ever come, that's great. But we had many great dinners during those days in New Zealand, and at one of them Lisa said to me, you need to speak at Thirsty Souls. And being a thirsty soul myself, I was attracted by the idea. I just need to say now, I'm no longer thirsty after a couple of beers, and I'm no longer hungry. So I said, sure, I'll do that next time I come, which I knew would be in April, because I'm here for a 2-month sabbatical leave. When the bishop said, where will you go on sabbatical leave? I said, Iowa, of course. And he looked a little bit blank, as though he didn't understand. But at one of these dinners in New Zealand in January, we're talking about, well, what should I talk about? And one person who's here tonight, Julie Langle there, said, just go for it, just get on with it. And I thought, that is a brilliant topic for a talk. Just get on with it, get on with it. And of course, the moment we see that as a topic for this reflection session, get on with it, we think, what is it? What are we getting on with? What is it? And I think the it is life. Get on with living. One of my favourite movies, I often ask in groups of people, what's your favourite movie? What movie have you seen more than 15 times? And for me, it's The Shawshank Redemption. And there's a great, you know the movie? I thought it was only known in New Zealand. It's known here as well. Oh, it's amazing. There's a great line, perhaps the best known line in the movie is Andy Dufresne, who's in a pretty difficult situation, wrongly imprisoned. And at one stage of the movie, and I won't get the quote exactly right, he says, get on with living or get on with dying. Make a decision, get on with living. And I think our problem very much is that we misunderstand what it is to get on with living. I'll give you an example. I realized a few years ago that most of my prayer was about trying or pleading with God to take away all the difficult parts of my life, and all the difficult people, and even all the difficult parishioners in my life. And that would be my prayer. God, if they go to another parish, I'm fine with that. See what you can arrange. So most of my prayer was about trying to get God to make life easier for me according to my own agenda. And then I realized that living is what we do in the midst of the difficult circumstances. And the thing that helped me to realize this was when I was having a pretty rough time, about 20 years ago now, and I thought, what will I do? And someone said, go on retreat to a monastery. So I went on retreat to a monastery, and I emailed the monastery before my arrival, and I said, I'd like to meet with one of the monks every day, just to chat. On the first day I arrived, they said, be in the parlour at this time. I went to the parlour, the monk came in, and I poured out my story of the difficulties of my life, the problem with the bishop and the other priests and the parishioners, all of it. And in the midst of my sharing, there was some anger and there was some tears. And at the end of probably 45 minutes, I ran out of things to say. I kind of talked it all out. And so I stopped and waited. I realized I was waiting for him to solve my problem. And he didn't say anything. He just looked at me and nodded like a wise, holy man. So I gestured to him. I said, well? And he looked some more and nodded some more, and I kind of waited. And when he realized that I wasn't going to let him away with saying nothing, he said, wow, John, you are really living. And I was angry with him. I was angry because he was meant to solve my problem. But what he was saying to me in those few words is, this is life, get used to it, get on with it. It was a very powerful shift for me because my prayer changed at that point. And instead of, God, take away this person, God, take away this problem, God, remove this difficulty, God, give me more money, God, give me better health, God, give me better relations, all of it. Instead of praying that, it became, God, where can I see you here? Why am I going through this? And then I realized that the way that we experience Christ in our lives is in the midst of the circumstances that we are in, whatever they are. If they're good, that's where we'll meet Christ. If they're terrible, that's where we'll meet Christ. Why? Because our faith is a faith not in which we try to do good and say more prayers to please and appease a distant God, but our faith is about a God who in Jesus Christ comes to us. And not only that, but in the Eucharist, God comes into us. Wow, that's pretty intimate, that's pretty close. But notice, we don't have to go anywhere else to meet God. God comes to us, wherever we are. And all we have to do is be where we are. The problem is most of the time we're not where we are. We're trying to be somewhere else. We're trying to create a situation where I think I'll be more ready for God or more open to God, or where God will be able to work, or the bishop or the pope will be happier with. No, our faith is about a God who comes to us. That's why on so many Christmas cards or Christmas messengers, for those who still send them, we see that great word, Emmanuel, a name which means
God is with us.
God is with us. You see, our problem, I think, is that we don't really believe that God is with us. We believe that God was with them 2,000 years ago in another place, in a foreign land, but we don't really believe that God is with us. He is. And the place where we will experience God is in the midst of the reality of our lives, whatever that is, whatever the reality is. If it's good, that's where we'll experience God. If it's bad, terrible, that's where we'll experience God. And our greatest desire in life is not to be free of suffering, but to experience love, intimacy, Christ, in the midst of the situation that we are in. I remember a number of years ago, 30 years ago now, Pope St. John Paul taught every Wednesday at his Wednesday audiences for about a year on what he called the theology of the body. And he said that in human life there are 3 stages. So we're talking about not just one person's human life, but all of human existence. So there was the period that he called before the sin of Adam and Eve, and he called that our original humanity. And then he talked about the period after the earth no longer exists, the future. He called it, don't be frightened by the big word, the eschatological reality. And then he said there's the situation we're in now that goes from the sin of Adam and Eve until the end of the world, and he called that the historical reality. And one of the characteristics of historical reality is suffering. But because of Christ, suffering's not a problem, it's a pathway. So again, here am I praying I was praying so much, God take away the suffering. But our historical humanity, where we are in our world, is about encountering Christ in the middle of the suffering. A couple of examples of this. The first is, I often as a priest get calls from people saying, Father, you don't know us, but we'd like to have the baby done. Now, we're meant to know what having the baby done means. It means having the baby baptized. But that's what they say. We want to have the baby done. And I say, when would you like to have your child baptized? So we arrive there at the baptism a few weeks later. And what I want to do, I've never done this, but what I want to do is to take the baby and to hold the baby and say, you have a beautiful baby. Now, I've said that part, but I then want to say to them, you want me to baptize your baby? And they would say, yes. And then I want to say to them, you want me to take your beautiful baby and baptize your beautiful baby, which is initiating your baby into the life of Christ. You want me to do that? And they would say, yes. And then I want to say to them, I've never said it, but I'd like to say to them, you want me to take your beautiful baby and baptize your beautiful baby, which is initiating your child into the life of Christ, which is a life of being misunderstood, betrayed, and crucified as a criminal. You want me to initiate your baby into that life? And at that point, they probably wish they'd gone to the Baptists or the Anglicans or someone else. But that's exactly what we're doing when we baptize. We are not wishing suffering on the child. That would be masochistic. We're not wishing suffering on the child. We're acknowledging the fact that every human who has ever existed has suffered. And because of Christ, suffering is the pathway. That's why we hang crucifixes in our room. Not just a cross that's painted beautifully and colourful and is a work of art, but a crucifix with a bleeding, dying or dead man on it. Why? Because for us as Catholic Christians, that crucifix reminds us not of an end, which it is for everyone else, but a pathway. And you see, we know this in our own lives too, because if you look back over the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, however many years, you'll be aware that the times in your life where you've experienced the greatest connection with others and meaning have often been the times of suffering. I remember about 14 years ago now, my parents both died relatively young, within 12 months of each other, to the day, 12 months. So my mother died first, and we nursed her at home, and then she died. We had the funeral. We tried to help my dad get on with life, which he did. And then 12 months minus 1 day, he died, age 73. So we gathered again for the funeral. We buried my father beside my mother, and then it came time for everyone to go away home, to go back to their own homes. And there was I left in the rectory at night. I remember at 10 o'clock, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I remember sitting there, sipping as I do sometimes at 10 o'clock at night, a glass of milk or something else. Thinking back of those days, now, we gathered together as a family for the 3 weeks before my father died. We lived in the house. It was a mess. I remember that when my mother was dying, we turned the house into a real tip as well. Like, it was just a mess. It was a good thing my mother was confined to bed for those 3 weeks. We destroyed her house. But people were coming and going, and someone would shake me awake at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, John, time, your turn. So I'd kind of get up and go and sit by Mum, and they would get into the bed that I'd gone out of, and sometimes late at night or over meals we would have some of the best laughs that we'd ever had as a family. And then at other moments in those weeks, we had some of the biggest family fights that we have ever had. We said things to each other that no family member should ever say to each other. So there I was a couple of weeks after my father's funeral, sitting there late at night, just pondering and thinking, oh gosh, I miss those days. And then I thought, I'm crazy. They were terrible days. My father was dying. And then I thought, no, I really do. It's like we were really living. We were really connecting with each other. Sure, we were fighting. Sure, we were laughing, but we were really living. You see, that's the point. See, the place where if we want to experience Christ, the place where we'll experience Christ is in the midst of our living. And perhaps our problem is that we're trying to avoid living very often. We see a difficult situation, or there's a worry or an anxiety that's growing in us. We think, oh, I don't want that, and we kind of move back from it. Instead of saying, God, whatever you send, whatever arrives, whatever circumstances are part of my life, what I'm going to do is not fight to get out of them, but like you, look for the divine presence in the midst of the situation. You see, this enables us to grow. I remember hearing Bishop Robert Barron a few years ago saying, it's time a lot of Catholics just grew up. It's like we try to live with a childish kind of faith. I keep these rules, I say these prayers, I do all of the right things in the hope of winning an eternal salvation. Now those who live that way, I have no doubt they will be saved. But it's hard work. What Bishop Barron was trying to communicate was that, thank you, milk comes in different shapes and sizes. What Bishop Barron was trying to convey was that when we are very small, particularly as Catholics, we learn to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. We go to church, we say our prayers, we do all of these things, and then we get to age 15, 16, 17, and it's not enough. But then what happens? If we are healthy and if we're really living, at those years, age 16, 17, 18, 20, 25, 30, life's complexity begins to surround us. That's the very thing that invites us to greater maturity of faith. It's not enough for us simply to be good religious people, but to be people of adult, mature faith. We're called to live more deeply, and that is to experience Christ in the midst of whatever situation we find ourselves. The circumstances that we are in, whatever they are, Christ allows us to be in for our maturity. As Kevin mentioned, I have a website which is called Food for Faith, and it began about 10 years ago, just as me writing reflections about what was happening in the midst of my day and sharing these reflections online. And it grew from a simple blog site to a website, and now has a good number of readers all around the world, including Iowa. But then I realized that the best parts of the pieces that I wrote were not my reflections, but the comments that readers would add. So I collected, as a result of people pleading with me, you need to publish these reflections into a book. So I published the reflections, and that book, as Kevin mentioned, is available. I would love to be able to give the book away, but unfortunately I have to sell it to cover publishing costs, and it's $25 US, and you can do a lot with $25 US, but the book is available. But then I thought, like, okay, that's a useful start, but what about the comments that people are writing? Because the people who really encourage us tend today not to be priests or bishops or religious, but people like ourselves. I realized when I was ordained that a seminary had prepared me for 7 years to be a priest, and I think when I was ordained, I had the sense that I'd now got the knowledge that I needed to go and to pass on with others. I remember arriving in the first parish that I was appointed to, and on Fridays I would take communion to people who were housebound or were unwell. And I arrived on one Friday to visit this woman whose name I remember very well. Her name was Vera. And Vera was elderly. She was probably 90-ish at that stage. She was living in the house from which she had buried her parents, her husband, and her only son. So she was remaining in this house. And when I went in on the first day, there she was seated at a little table with a white cloth, a couple of candles and a crucifix. And I said to her, "Hi Vera, how are you?" But she didn't want to talk. I realized after a while she just wanted Christ. I was just the instrument. So I learnt over the weeks, visiting her every week, just to go in and greet her gently and begin in the name of the Father and of the Son. And then I would give her communion. She'd spent the hour or two before preparing, reading with the scriptures and praying, and I would then give her communion. And just as I stood up to leave each day, I learned she didn't want a conversation. And I would say, "Vera, is there anything I can do for you?" And there never was anything. "Thank you, Father. Goodbye." One day I said, "Vera, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "Yes. Could you put some coal on the fire?" The house was freezing cold. And there was some coal beside an open fire. "Certainly, Vera," I said. So I took the little coal shovel and I filled it with coal and I went to put it on the fire. She said, "No, no." I said, "What is it?" She said, "The coal is so expensive. 2 pieces. So I took 2 pieces and placed them on the fire. The fire sort of struggled to give any warmth, and I left the house and went back to the rectory, and I was sitting at lunch with the other priest that I was with. Is that Lisa Sitzman's phone? This is a
My mother.
What a moment.
What a moment. You chose that. Does anyone remember what I was saying? Lisa's phone. So I went back home to the rectory and I was sitting at lunch with the other priest whose name was Jerry. And Jerry said to me, "John, do you know anyone who needs a trailer load of coal for the winter?" Because I'd had a phone call from someone who wants to give a load of coal to someone who needs it. And I said, "Jerry, I can't believe you're asking today. This is divine intervention. I know exactly the person who needs it." He said, "Who?" And I said, "Vera Larkham." And Jerry laughed. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Vera has just phoned offering to pay for a load of coal for someone else." And do you know the reason I tell that story, and I remember it so well almost 40 years after, is because Vera is one of the best teachers I have ever had. She had never studied theology. She had never read a book of theology in her life. She probably, being the age she was, hadn't even read too much of the scriptures. She was Catholics and we didn't tend to in those days. But she is one of my greatest teachers about relationship with God and the difference it makes to life. So what I realized from stories like Vera and from the many comments that people have written on the website is that people's experience of Christ is our greatest teacher, not priests. If I speak about an experience of Christ, people say, "Oh yeah, that he's a priest, of course he says that kind of stuff." But when you, each one of you, speak about your experience of Christ, people listen and they are changed. Therefore, the second book that I am writing is a book that's written by people like yourselves. And on Easter Sunday, as part of my sabbatical, I invited people to write 200, 300, 400 words on one experience of God, one experience of Christ, just one, and to share that. And already a good number of beautiful reflections have come in from people who've never studied theology, but they have lived life. And at times, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, not able to sleep, worried about money or family or health, these people have said, God, help me. God, if you exist, if you are there, if you are interested, help me. If any of you feel like writing a reflection, please do. I look forward to hearing from you. Well, I wonder now, I will, this opportunity for a minute or two of questions. Lisa? Thank you. Or Tammy? Thank you. What a great initiative to have people gathered together like this. But if I were to give tonight's little reflection a title, it would have to be something like, I wonder what you think you'd call it after you've heard what I've said. I love that word Emmanuel. God is with us. Not God was with them 2,000 years ago, or God is with them because they're always in the church. No, God is with us, wherever we are. And your children and grandchildren, I think of my cousins and my sister and brothers who have no connection with the church at all. God is with them. I'll just finish very briefly with Pope John the 23rd. He was Pope from 1958 to 1963. And it was a time of great turmoil for the church. And they say that his bedtime prayer was, well, God, it's your church, I'm off to bed. Not a bad thing. Well, God, they're your kids, I'm off to bed. And the very last story. There's a great meeting in Italy, which I've had the privilege of being part of a few times. It's a big meeting for friendship among people, a gathering of faith. A couple of years ago, there were 800,000 people at the meeting, spread over that's 750,000 people at this meeting. And one year, a few years ago, I was there. The average age of the people at the meeting is probably 40. I'm really young. I'm like an old man now. And I noticed that a lot of the people present were wearing the same t-shirt. And my Italian was almost nothing then. All I could say back then was, una birra per favore. You know enough Italian or Spanish to know what it means. So they were wearing this t-shirt, a lot of people, with Italian writing on the front, and I recognized one word, D-I-O. I knew that D-I-O was God. But I had to say to my friends, this t-shirt that everyone's wearing, what does it mean? And they laughed and said, it means, there is a God, it's not you. Relax. Thank you very much.